Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Phyllis summers in a way that indeed her sharp instincts and lifelong survival chops could end overrun, because fate, timing, and two of the most dangerous men she has ever crossed aligned with ruthless perfection, beginning on a quiet evening when Phyllis, formerly suspicious of the unusual silence girding Chancellor Winters and Newman Enterprises, followed a gut feeling that told her commodity was veritably wrong. A feeling born from times of treason, spying, and blood-stained secrets that no way truly stay buried in the city. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the abandoned office sect at Newman Tower that night, but Phyllis has no way been good at following rules, especially when her instincts scream that power is shifting hands, and as she dallied just beyond an incompletely open door, the voices inside set her blood, because she honored them incontinently. Victor Newman, calm, commanding, hugely merciless, and Cain Ashby, tense yet bent a man, who had easily crossed a line he could no way step back from. What Phyllis heard in those coming many twinkles would seal her fate, as Victor laid out a cold wave, calculated strategy that involved dismembering multiple alliances, manipulating stock movements, and most nipping of all, removing changeable arrears, who could expose the verity. And when Cain spoke next, his voice was low, equivocal, but eventually biddable, agreeing that certain people knew too important, and that loose ends had to be handled permanently, an expression that echoed in Phyllis's mind like a projectile, because she knew exactly what Victor meant, and when Victor listed names not audibly, but through recrimination, Phyllis realized with horrifying clarity that she herself was one of them. Her breath caught, her heart pounded, and for the first time in times, sweat, not wrathfulness, not adrenaline, pure fear surged through her, because Victor wasn't ranting, he wasn't hanging, he was planning, and Victor Newman planning means someone disappears. Phyllis backed down quietly, every step measured, but fate turned cruel in a twinkle when the bottom creaked beneath her heel, a bitsy sound, slightly conspicuous, yet enough for Victor to break mid-sentence, his instincts as sharp as hers, his eyes narrowing as he said still, "We're not alone." And in that moment Phyllis ran, not out of fear, but strategy, bolting down the corridor, her mind contending through exits, abettance, and escape routes, formally calculating who she could trust, who she could advise. But Genoa City is small when important men decide it is, and within twinkles security cautions were touched off, doors locked, and her phone lost signal, because Victor Newman controls everything. Cain caught up to her first, his face visited, his voice contending as he blocked her path, telling her she shouldn't have heard what she did, telling her it wasn't supposed to be this way. But Phyllis, no way one to supplicate, fired back with venom, reminding him that he chose this path, that he vended his soul for power, and that Victor would discard him just as fluently as anyone differently. Words that struck deep enough to make Cain vacillate. But vacillation is fatal in Victor's world, and Victor himself appeared moments laterally, his presence stinking the air from the room, his aspect steady, his tone nearly regretful as he said Phyllis had always been redoubtable, always dangerous, always insolvable to control, and that was precisely why she couldn't be allowed to walk down. Phyllis laughed also, a sharp, recalcitrant sound, telling Victor that he could silence her voice but not the verity, that she had formerly left trails, formerly set contingencies in stir. But Victor only smiled, because he planned for that too, and as Phyllis was attended out under the guise of a security concern, Genoa City above continued ignorant, lights glowing, lives intertwining, while one of its fiercest survivors was being cancelled. What followed was nippy and terrifyingly effective. Phyllis dissolved, her phone setup smashed, her auto abandoned near the outskirts of city, rumors spreading like campfire that she'd snapped again, that she'd run off, that she was hiding from another mess she created, and the people who loved her felt that familiar pang of query because Phyllis Summers has faded ahead, but this time felt different, heavier, final. Summer tasted it incontinently, a mama's suspicion screaming that commodity was wrong, while Jack Abbott scuffled with guilt for not hearkening when Phyllis advised him weeks before that Victor and Cain were over to commodity dangerous. commodity that would bring lives, and meanwhile Victor proceeded business as usual, smooth, his conglomerate complete, Cain promoted and intimately praised, though intimately unraveling under the weight of what he'd helped do, visited by Phyllis's eyes in that final moment, recalcitrant, furious, unbroken, and yet beneath the face, cracks began to form, because barring Phyllis Summers isn't like erasing a name from a tally. She's chaos, she's consequence, and the verity has a way of clawing its way back into the light. And indeed, as Genoa City mourned or suspected or moved on, whispers began circulating, anonymous tips surfacing, documents oohing, secrets unraveling at the seams, suggesting that Phyllis may have anticipated this outgrowth later each, that she may have offered herself to expose commodity far bigger, commodity that could destroy Victor Newman formerly and for all. Cain, trapped in the ministry of Victor's power, began to realize too late that aligning with Victor meant endless blood on his hands, and as the weight of guilt crushed him, observers were left with the creepy question: was Phyllis truly excluded, or did she orchestrate the ultimate evaporating act, one that would bring Genoa City to its knees when the verity eventually explodes? Because in the young and the restless, no bone is ever truly gone, and Phyllis Summers has no way lost a war without leaving scars that last ever. And yet, indeed, as Phyllis Summers sounded to evaporate into thin air, leaving only whispers and echoes of her presence before, the ripple effect of her exposure began to spread like campfire through Genoa City, kindling fear, dubitation, and paranoia among those who had ever crossed paths with her. Because Phyllis was no way just a woman who lived in the murk, she was a force of nature, a hurricane of intelligence, charm, and ruthlessness, and those who undervalued her paid the price. And now the megacity was pulsing on the edge of chaos, because the people who had formerly called her friend, nut, adversary, or rival realized, each in their own way, that Phyllis Summers had been the fulcrum around which so numerous of their fates had spun, and without her, the delicate web of power, treason, and ambition was unraveling in ways no bone could prognosticate. Not indeed Victor Newman himself, whose icy control over the megacity's frugality, politics, and felonious swings suddenly felt vulnerable, because barring Phyllis hadn't just removed an handicap, it had awakened a storm, and storms do and admire walls, rules, or alliances, as Adam Newman, lately freed from yet another dangerous trap, discovered nearly incontinently, pacing in his extension with an admixture of rage, unbelief, and seductiveness, realizing that Victor's decision to remove Phyllis so decisively had unintended consequences, that her absence was the ending of a chapter but the opening of a conflagration, because in every deal Adam had struck, every manipulation he'd orchestrated, Phyllis's name had been a silent shadow, a wild card whose conduct could destroy or redeem him at any moment. And now that wild card had been taken from him, leaving him unmoored, suspicious of every supporter, every adversary, and indeed his own instincts, which had guided him true in the history but now screamed warnings he could ignore. And across city, Sharon, whose own life had been entwined with Phyllis through love, contest, and bitter backstabbings, felt a nipping emptiness, a void where one of her most redoubtable counterparts had always was, because Phyllis had been both a glass and a challenge, someone who forced Sharon to defy her own darkness, her own capacity for manipulation, her own vulnerabilities, and now Sharon faced the intimidating consummation that the megacity had come a bloodsucker's playground in Phyllis's absence, that Victor and Cain had struck a decisive blow, but one that left a crack that would mold, because the heart of Genoa City beats strongest in the chaos between ambition and survival, and chaos is Phyllis Summers' sphere, a sphere from which she'd no way truly be gutted, no matter how strictly Victor had planned, no matter how biddable Cain had tried to be. Meanwhile, Cain Ashby set up himself in an agony of his own timber, trapped between fidelity to Victor and guilt over the woman he'd formerly considered a friend, a nut, indeed a moral compass in moments when he'd questioned his own path, because watching Phyllis be silenced, knowing he'd played a part in her elimination, twisted commodity inside him that he couldn't unsee. That would not leave him in the quiet moments when he allowed. No bone was watching, because the look on her face, The defiance, the fury, had been burned into his memory, and he realized too late that adhering Victor Newman comes with costs that cannot be measured in plutocrat, power, or respect. It is measured in the death of heart, the corrosion of tone, and the creepy knowledge that some deeds cannot be undone. And as Kane moved through the corridors of Newman Enterprises, continuing duties he'd formerly delighted, he couldn't shake the feeling of unnoticeable eyes, of whispers that followed him like murk, of the sense that Phyllis Summers's mind, her influence, her plans, might formerly be moving against him, quietly, invisibly, in a way that Victor could no way anticipate, and this fear eroded at him relentlessly, because he understood, deep down, that Phyllis had always been one step ahead, always seeing the angles no bone differently could, and her exposure might be her most audacious strategy yet, a move so brilliant, so cunning, that it would not only survive her physical absence, but grow more dangerous with each passing day, ringing like a vine through the corridors of power, the storeroom bottoms, the boardrooms, and the alleyways of Genoa City, a ghost in the machine, unseen but universal. Indeed, as Victor celebrated his apparent palm, orchestrating meetings, issuing commands, and asserting his dominance with his usual surgical perfection, cracks began to appear in his conglomerate, subtle but inarguable, because barring Phyllis Summers hadn't removed the consequences of her presence, only laid over them, and Victor, who had always believed that he could manipulate, force, and dominate every aspect of the megacity, discovered for the first time a creeping mistrustfulness. A flicker of query, as reports began arriving from the corners of his businesses and his abetta's rumored rumors of covert documents, blurted secrets, and deals that didn't add up, and though Victor dismissed them outwardly with his characteristic arrogance, intimately, a kernel of apprehension took root, because he knew better than anyone that Phyllis Summers had no way been predictable, no way direct, no way logical in the way she maneuvered her chess pieces, and now, in the silence left by her absence, that unpredictability hung like a blade over his conglomerate, staying for a single misstep, a single lapse, a single moment when the precisely constructed vision of control could shatter, transferring everything he'd erected crashing down in a spectacular, unpreventable collapse. Across city, Nick Newman, who had always had a complicated relationship with Phyllis, felt a storm of clashing feelings, wrathfulness, grief, remorse, and a cold wave, burning fear, because Nick had formerly trusted her, loved her, been betrayed by her, forgiven her, and plotted alongside her, and now he realized with a horror that settled deep in his casket that her exposure created a vacuum that couldn't be filled, because Phyllis had been the machine that drove certain schemes, the bone, who knew when to act and when to stay, who balanced ambition with caution, ruthlessness with slyness, and now Nick was left scrabbling in the fate, trying to anticipate moves he could no longer prognosticate, trying to compensate for the absence of a strategist whose intelligence battled indeed Victor's, and in doing so, he made miscalculations, small at first, nearly inappreciable, but miscalculations that would compound, because in Genoa City, one misstep leads to another, a chain. Response of occasion, treason, and exposure. And without Phyllis Summers as either supporter or adversary, that chain began to twist in directions no bone could provision. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate among those who operated on the circumferences of the megacity, from the demi-world snitchers to commercial interposers, from the putatively inconsequential workers to the untouchable power brokers, because everyone had known, or allowed. They had known that Phyllis had faded, but exposure in Genoa City infrequently equates to futurity, and soon hints, suggestions, fractions of substantiation began surfacing, like breadcrumbs left by a master tactician, suggesting that Phyllis may have anticipated Victor's every move, may have planned for her elimination as the ultimate strategy to expose corruption, to manipulate commitment, and to ensure that when she returned, the megacity, and those who believed they had triumphed over her, would fall into a trap so intricate, so precise, that it would leave reports destroyed, alliances shattered, and power redistributed in ways that only Phyllis Summers could orchestrate, and as these fractions circulated, Fear gurgled through the social and commercial strata because those who had formerly dismissed her as reckless, emotional, or changeable began to realize that Phyllis's recklessness was in fact her topmost armament, that her apparent chaos was always a mask for computation, and that removing her from the board didn't neutralize her, but amplified the peril she posed, like a fire left to smolder underground, staying for the perfect moment to enkindle. Indeed, in her absence, Phyllis's influence began to manifest in subtle, nearly inappreciable ways, from manipulated stock tips reaching the wrong people, to contracts mysteriously failing, to whispers of alliances forming where no alliances should have was, because Phyllis had been scrupulous in leaving contingency plans, agents, and delegates who would carry out her directives in ways that were unnoticeable to the untrained eye, and Cain, haunted and decreasingly erratic, began to see patterns he couldn't explain, documents he couldn't regard for, and phone calls that sounded to appear from nowhere, all of which refocused to a single, intimidating verity. Phyllis Summers had anticipated her elimination and turned it into an armament more important than anyone, including Victor, could imagine, and as the days passed, the pressure in Genoa City came nearly unsupportable because everyone tasted, indeed if they couldn't articulate, that the balance of power had shifted, that the game had changed, and that Phyllis Summers, whether alive, retired, or orchestrating from the murk, remained the single most dangerous player in the megacity, the Bone, who could destroy or save anyone she chose, and that knowledge alone created paranoia, fear, and everlasting enterprise, because in a megacity erected on secrets, ambition, and vengeance, knowing that one woman had the power to upend everything was a terror more potent than any visible trouble. As this pressure erected, other crucial players were drawn into the whirlpool, from Victoria Newman, scuffling with the moral negotiations of her father's conglomerate, to Nikki Newman, who felt the void left by the friend she had formerly tried to cover, to Jack Abbott, whose business wit and particular vendettas collided with the new misgivings, and all the while, every character, every alliance, every decision was told, deliberately or intentionally, by the shadow of Phyllis Summers, because she had always understood, in ways no Bone differently could, that control isn't exercised through force alone, but through perception, influence, and expectation, and now that control radiated outward indeed in her absence, touching every corner of Genoa City like a ghostly hand, manipulating issues, exposing weakness, and forcing those who allowed. They were in power to defy the horrifying consummation that the game was no longer theirs to play, that the rules had changed, and that Phyllis Summers, excluded or not, had formerly won. Indeed, Victor, the man who believed he could bend the world to his will, began to show cracks beneath the veneer of dominance, subtle but inarguable. As deals faltered, Cain wavered, and the megacity itself sounded to respond to a force beyond his control, a force that carried Phyllis's intelligence, cunning, and strategic brilliance. Because power in Genoa City isn't just about plutocrat or influence, it is about foresight, computation, and the capability to survive the survivalists. And Phyllis Summers, removed from sight, had formerly deposited herself at the center of the storm, a storm that would ultimately sweep through boardrooms, living apartments, and aft alleys likewise, leaving destruction, disclosure, and metamorphosis in its wake, and as the narrative unfolded, observers could only watch, breathless, as the ultimate assignment came clear in Genoa City. No elimination is endless, no palm is absolute, and no Bone, not indeed Victor Newman, can truly anticipate the genius, the audacity, and the grim will of Phyllis Summers.